The failure of drug war is glaringly obvious to judges, cops, wardens, prosecutors, and millions more now calling for decriminalization, legalization, the end of prohibition. Let us investigate the century of lies.
Hello, and welcome to Century of Lies. I'm your host, Doug McVeigh. This is our second holiday special featuring archived material, some of which has not been broadcast on this show. Let's start with this from a 2016 interview with journalist and best-selling author Maya Solovitz. Not long ago, you were in Baltimore to address a group of journalists about covering drugs and drug addiction. I was working at a different conference. I couldn't make it to your talk. So for my benefit, as well as the listeners, what advice did you give to those reporters?
Well, the first thing I would say is question everything. Unfortunately, for a really long time, the media has not been skeptical enough of our drug policy. And it has basically repeated these sensational and often racist myths about addiction without checking. A policeman says, like, oh, this guy was on PCP and he had the power of 10 men. Well, okay, is that really true? If you actually look at the rat research, at least on PCP, it makes muscles weaker. There's an entire medical literature on this stuff that nobody ever looks at. So the first thing I always say is, be extremely skeptical. And secondly, cover this like a science journalist, not like a crime journalist or a political journalist. No offense. But, really, really look into the science so that you are focused on what we actually know, what we don't know, and can go from there rather than just being, well, Joe said this and Jane said that, and we're not going to take any perspective.
Gosh, now it has improved, hasn't it? I mean, I remember the 80s, and that was ridiculous.
No, it has improved tremendously, and I think a sort of major undercovered story is how the internet forced it to change. Because once you have all these internet fact checkers and the actual experts can respond to your completely bogus claims, the media has to start getting better at what it does. Because otherwise people are just going to go straight to the experts and are not going to pay attention to the media. And obviously we've had tremendous upheaval in how journalists get paid, et cetera. But the fact that if you make a bizarro, wrong scientific claim, and then the researcher can instantly say on his blog that gets widely tweeted and, widely disseminated that this was completely bogus and here's the data that shows it, you're going to start being more careful. Also, the early days of the internet were sort of dominated by people who were either liberals or libertarians who were very pro-legalization and pro-drug reform. And they sort of were among the founders of the net, and that sort of created a bias that, in a good way, shifted against the overwhelming consensus that everybody thought that prohibition is a good idea and would be a good idea forever. So that early advantage of this, at first, very marginal view helped the internet sort of become a place where you could actually get access to honest, factual information. And when people saw that, they began to stop believing the nonsense.
So, in a way, we could say that some of the recent successes in the last few years, legalization initiatives, broader acceptance of harm reduction, may just come down to better communication and better access to information.
I think that's true. Obviously, I do not want to discount the hard work of many, many, many activists. It obviously counts a lot. But the net allowed them to organize in a way that they hadn't previously been, and allowed views from the outside to get into the mainstream in a way that hasn't been as well chronicled. Actually, a friend of mine, Alyssa Port, wrote a book about how the outside is now moving inside and how this has sort of changed everything. And I think the internet and drugs is a really good example of that.
Oh, indeed. Well, yes. I mean, the internet, the web, it's a tool, and a tool is only useful if it's put to use, and that we have done.
Yes, I mean, I think like one of the things that is amazing is like the Arrowhead site. And that site, is just a bunch of people's, more than this, but it includes thousands of people's experiences with drugs. And there you can see the experiences that do not lead to addiction.
Maya, what kind of impact do you hope that your book, that your new book, Unbroken, this is your 6th book?
I think it's 7.
7.
Yes. But one of them was kind of ghostwritten, so there would be no way for other people to need to know that. But yes, what I would hope is, and the point of writing the book really was, I wanted to get us past this, it's a crime, it's a disease debate. I don't mind if you call it a medical disorder or even a disease, as long as you understand that that does not mean that your brain is broken or that it's progressive. But, there's no evidence that people with addiction are just horrible, obnoxious people who are hedonists and want to destroy their lives and the lives of their families for the sake of 10 minutes of being high. That is not what's going on in addiction. People with addiction have more pain and trouble before they become addicted, and that is why they tend to become addicted. So I just wanted to have a way to get past that debate and say that it's medical, but not say that it's medical in the way that we have done, that has unfortunately supported criminalization and has supported keeping addiction treatment out of mainstream medicine.
I've got to ask, I just came back from New York. The United Nations General Assembly special session on drugs was, at the time of this recording, just a week ago. The world's nations got together and basically did very little. And yet, you could argue that we made progress because they did not endorse the global drug war and declare that we'd have a drug-free world in 10 more years. How do you think that the debate is shifting, and where do you think it's in a year from now? A year from now, your book is still going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, and how do you think the debate is going to be changed?
Well, I really hope so. I think that the UN meeting was fascinating in that, yes, it turned out that nothing happened, but also simply the fact that the United States is in violation of the UN conventions because our states some states have legalized and more states will probably do so soon, means that we can't act as the world's narc anymore, and we can't go stomping around into Canada and say, no, you can't legalize, you're violating the conventions, and we're going to mess with you regarding trade if you do that. And we did that kind of stuff in the past all the time. So simply having us out of commission as the world's drug cop is a good thing. And, the fact that, yes, we didn't say we're going to have a world free of drugs in 10 years. I think they said we're going to have a world free of drug abuse in 10 years, but which is almost as silly. But it is progress. And I think there is probably a threat to sort of international law if we don't come up with a way to either say, oh, well, yes, these conventions, no matter what they said in the past, actually do allow states to legalize if they feel like it, or actually change them, because otherwise they will become irrelevant because we're going to have lots of countries doing lots of different things. And, I mean, it may not be a bad thing if they become irrelevant, but in terms of the drug laws, but it might be a bad thing in terms of the UN's credibility on other issues, and that is something that people really need to think about.
What kind of drug policy should we be aiming for?
I think we should legalize marijuana. There is no reason not to legalize marijuana. We should decriminalize possession of all drugs because locking people in a cage does nothing to fight addiction, and stigmatizing drug use does not prevent people from becoming addicted. In fact, it may make them more likely to become addicted. So, criminalizing drug possession, low-level drug possession, and low-level drug dealing has done no good, has done tons of harm. But how do we deal with something like cocaine and heroin where, you really don't want Philip Morris crack? I wouldn't be especially happy with Philip Morris marijuana, but it could not, because of the nature of the substance, do anything like the kind of damage that Philip Morris crack could do. So how do we deal with these other substances? I think that's going to require a longer-term discussion and figure out, and being able to figure out the best ways to use regulation, and the best ways to, because I can't figure out a way to stop the violence of the trade without some form of regulation of the product. The alternative could be things like legalizing less harmful versions of things. But there's all kinds of simply making progress towards decriminalization for users would be an enormous improvement. And as we legalize marijuana, there are going to be different models of it. So we should see what is the role of commercialization. Like, if we allow a completely insane commercial market, like, how bad does it get? I obviously don't want that to be a problem, but, it's possible that it could be. I mean, I think personally that even if you marketed marijuana excessively, you would have so much positive substitution for alcohol and perhaps opioids to some extent that it wouldn't be a problem. But, that's an empirical question. And while I would absolutely prefer non-commercial sales, I think we are going in the direction of commercial sales because of the way the United States is set up. And I think since regulatory capture is definitely a thing that can happen, we really want to, before we create a market for something, restrict the marketing and restrict these kinds of things so that we can minimize harm. I think that, people have been using drugs since before we evolved into humans. If you just look at cats and catnip, you know that mammals like to get high. So we're never going to have a drug-free world or a world free of consciousness alteration, nor would we want to. What we want to do is minimize related harm, just like we wouldn't want to have an exploration-free world or a risk-free world. That would be insanely boring. We need to come up with ways to minimize harm and reduce risk, but nothing is ever going to be perfectly safe.
For the benefit of listeners who aren't up on drug policy, you mentioned minimizing harm reduction. Could you talk about that for just a minute or two?
Yes. I mean, I think that, basically the idea of harm reduction is that drug use is going to occur and drug addiction is probably going to occur. So how do we make sure people don't die? How do we make sure people don't spread diseases? How do we make sure that if people do become addicted, they have access to care that can help them recover? It's kind of like if you just think about seatbelts in cars. We didn't ban cars because they kill lots and lots of people. We recognize that, people like driving. And there are useful things that can be had in terms of that. So we do things to reduce harm. So it's not like this is like some kind of novel concept. With drugs, the sort of classic harm reduction intervention is needle exchange to prevent the spread of HIV. And one of the really interesting things is when you start doing needle exchange, people were afraid, oh my gosh, you're going to encourage people to use more. They'll never get into recovery if they have access to clean needles, and you're going to enable them. All of that turned out to be false. In fact, when you treat people as if they deserve to live, whether or not they do what you approve of, you make them feel a lot better. And when you make people with addiction feel better, they are less likely to want to escape and get high. And this is like this thing that we really don't understand, that being tough and being cruel and attacking people with addiction, that is why they get high. So if you want to actually have them not get high, you want to find ways to have them have hope and have them, feel okay in their own skin. Harm reduction is a really valuable way of doing that because when you give somebody a clean needle or an overdose-reducing shot or a safe injection facility where they can go and use, and in case anything bad happens, there are medical professionals there to help. When you do that, you say, I believe your life is worth living. And when people start to believe that they are valued by others, they start to value themselves. And when you value yourself, you're not going to want to destroy it.
A lot of great things that people have to think about, and it all goes back to what you were saying. Is about people connecting, and love and compassion, and things that a society should do. What question have I forgotten to ask you? What question should I have asked you that I haven't yet?
I think you have been pretty thorough there. I think that it's a complex subject. And it's a highly emotional subject, and people have been taught a lot of things that are actually harmful. So the more we can just actually look at the scientific research, actually try to listen to each other and empathize with each other and understand that, we can be coming from different places, but that doesn't mean that the person who is really different and experiences things really different is like bad or wrong. This stuff sounds kind of really basic, but if you, it really does come down to empathy and compassion, and it is kind of amazing to see what happens when you just treat people with dignity and respect, and how enormously helpful that by itself can be. Is that all you need? No, unfortunately not. But once you recognize that, people who use drugs and people who are addicted to drugs aren't these crazy aliens who are going to do all kinds of bad behavior, you can then begin to understand what's going on and, have people live healthier lives.
Any closing thoughts for the listeners? And oh heavens, yes. You have a website, I think, and I follow you on Twitter. But what's your Twitter handle?
Oh, sure. It's so the website and the Twitter handle are the same. They are MAIA, S like Sam, Z like zebra. So it's at Maya as Z for Twitter, and MayaAsZ.com is the website. And I also have a column that is in Vice, and another column that is on an addiction-related website called The Influence. And I really am excited to hear from people who have really been finding the ideas being addiction as a learning disorder. I found that a lot of people have found this really helpful, so I look forward to hearing from you.
That was part of my interview with journalist and best-selling author Maya Solowitz. It was originally recorded in 2016 on the release of her best-selling book, Unbroken Brain, A Revolutionary New Way of Understanding Addiction. Her new book is entitled Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. You're listening to Century of Lies. I'm your host, Doug McVeigh. In early 2020, I spoke with Kerwin Kay, Associate Professor of Sociology at Wesleyan University and the author of Enforcing Freedom, Drug Courts, Therapeutic Communities, and the Intimacies of the State. Here's part of that. You're talking about therapeutic communities, and that's something that it has a bad history, shall we say. Tell the listeners about Synanon.
Yeah, so therapeutic communities first began with this organization called Synanon. Synanon began in 1958 by a guy called Chuck Dieterich, who started with an AA group that was in Los Angeles. That was a mixed group of alcoholics, but also heroin users. And apparently those two groups eventually didn't get along, and he eventually started Synanon out of the heroin users that were going to that group. And he got his idea, interestingly, he, just as a side note, really, he got his inspiration while taking acid as part of a government-sponsored research project that is the same research project that the gentleman who started AA, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, but also received the inspiration for AA partly through this LSD experimental trial.
Bill Wilson, MK Ultra.
Yeah,
wow.
Bill Wilson, thank you. Yeah, and potentially, although I haven't been able to track this down for sure, but it's very likely that this was funded by the CIA through MK Ultra. And so that's where the inspiration comes. And then Dieterich seems to have designed Synanon, at least in part, based on media reports about Chinese brainwashing during the Korean War, which were very much in the news at the time when this was happening. So and Dieterich himself spoke about brainwashing, and he talked about the fact that people, he would be challenged, and he says, this sounds like brainwashing. And he would say, sure, everyone needs their brain washed every now and then, and especially drug users need their brains washed. And so nothing wrong with that. But so a lot of the techniques and specifically not just the humiliations in front of others, but also collective punishments, and also the way that community members are forced to police one another and are forced to tell one of the staff members if anyone breaks a rule. A lot of these things sort of came out of at least the media reports. It's not clear that the actual Chinese practices were exactly the same thing, but the media reports about brainwashing were something that he very much took in as part of Synanon. And Synanon had a few years as sort of a darling in the sun and in the media spotlight, and a lot of academics really got on board. A lot of media figures really got on board. A lot of countercultural media figures got on board. And even senators got on board. They were able to open up a small program within a prison in Arizona, in Nevada. And they were able to really start to make this vision happen. And they become very well known. Dieterich himself is credited with creating this phrase, "Today's the first day of the rest of your life," so he's became this pop cultural figure a little bit. Synanon sponsored free concerts in the Bay Area where prior to Woodstock, where like 70,000 people would show up. They, would help the Black Panthers. They would help United Farm Workers. So there's this very sort of interesting normalizing yet countercultural organization that then at a certain point seems to sort of gone off the deep end a bit. And Dieterich did things where he started an internal group called the Imperial Marines within Synanon, and they were there to make sure that no one would run away and to enforce any security issues that Synanon had. And sort of they became increasingly, quote, cult-like, and increasingly became known as a cult or called a cult. And Dieterich at one point then told everyone who they could marry, and he broke up a number of long-term relationships and said, nope, you are no longer together, and instead you're going to be with this person. And so his power just, got increasingly centralized and extreme. And the Imperial Marines, meanwhile, got in trouble, and Dieterich got in trouble because when one woman ran away from the facility and the Marines went and brought her back, she was able to get a lawyer eventually, and then Dieterich ordered some of the Imperial Marines to put a rattlesnake in his mailbox. I guess he had one of those rural mailboxes. And so they had chopped off the rattle of the rattlesnake, and the thing bit him when he opened it up, and he nearly died from this rattlesnake bite. So that was the thing that sort of got Dieterich removed as the director of Synanon. He had to agree to step down in order to avoid prosecution, but they basically had the goods on him. And but he remained with the organization. He remained around until his death. So and Synanon is still around. There's a branch in Germany, actually, that is still around. But for the most part, it has died out. But nevertheless, that model, despite some of its sort of kookier and eccentric aspects and cult-like aspects, became the model for drug treatment within prisons. And what happened there is that there had been an earlier model of treatment within prisons that was where inmates would pretty much control how the program went and had a lot of say in how these things were organized. And these were called democratic therapeutic communities. This is before Synanon called itself a therapeutic community. And these democratic therapeutic communities were precisely the type of thing that got targeted when the let's be tough on crime sort of movement started. And these programs got identified as coddling prisoners and letting them have too much say within the prison. And so those all got shut down. But the intensity and the punitiveness of Synanon's model appealed, and it was able to survive the move away from treatment within prisons. There nevertheless were still a few therapeutic communities of the Synanon variety, sometimes called hierarchical therapeutic communities, in a much more punitive model. Those survived. And then more punitive options within the prison got struck down by the Supreme Court. So the prisons actually tried to do some behaviorist programs where they would stick people into basements chained to a bed for long periods of time in order to convince people to cooperate. Those actually got struck down, or there was fear that they would be struck down by the Supreme Court. So they stopped doing those. And therapeutic communities were just punitive enough, but to not be accused of coddling prisoners, but not overly punitive in order to raise concerns from the Supreme Court, even though I think that they actually do, as a sometimes cruel and unusual punishment. And so they sort of were able to survive in this environment, even when the prison system was turning away from rehabilitation as an ideal. And then as there's been a somewhat of a return to treatment within the prison system, therapeutic communities have been there and have really been able to take off, and they have become the model within the criminal justice system. Like I say, there are outpatient forms of treatment that I did not study as part of my research, but part of the reason I didn't study that, only about 25% of the people manage to avoid residential treatment. 75% of the people end up in residential treatment. And also, I was more interested in what's happening to the people who need relief from the war on drugs the most. So I was looking sort of more at the most intense parts of what was happening. So I didn't end up looking at the outpatient. But so that, there are 25% of the people, again, it can be a good deal. Drug court can be a good deal for some people. They're doing anywhere from 10 to 40 hours a week of outpatient treatment, and that's a lot less onerous, obviously, than having to be there 24/7 in a place where people are yelling at you and coming up with creative forms of humiliation, and you're subject to collective punishment if you're not enforcing the rules against each other, and so on. So, for some people it can be a good deal, and their experience with drug courts can be a positive thing, and then there's a lot of people who are really experiencing the downsides, and very negative downsides.
That was part of my interview from 2020 with Kerwin Kay, Associate Professor of Sociology at Wesleyan University and the author of Enforcing Freedom, Drug Courts, Therapeutic Communities, and the Intimacies of the State. This has been Century of Lies. This is Doug McVeigh saying so long. So long. For the Drug Truth Network, this is Doug McVeigh asking you to examine our policy of drug prohibition, the Century of Lies. Drug Truth Network programs archived at the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy.